You've broken your vows 1,000 times. Come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of thee, horses of caravan of despair, come yet and come. Come, whoever you are, come, whoever you are, horses
Just a little setting up there. In the 17th century, Queen Elizabeth died and King James came to the throne, and King James was bothered. He said that the English translation of the Bible that existed didn't show proper respect to the king. So he had a new Bible translated, and that's called the King James Bible. So I don't have to tell you what I think of that translation. I think you can guess. The committee that translated the King James Bible put these words into the mouth of Jesus. Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. The notion of perfection is one of the most destructive ideas ever perpetuated on humanity. It means an ideal entity devoid of flaws. People who demand perfection are setting themselves up for disappointment. There is no perfect. What there is in the real and existing world, where every life form, every natural phenomenon is not perfect, but its own wonderful self. And it is a changing world. Nothing stays the same. Perfection demands the status quo. No time, no change, no life. Reading Matthew in the Greek yields this translation. Be ye whole, as your divine parent calls you to be. It's different. To be whole, to be what you are intended to be. Loving, thoughtful, helpful, relational, uniquely yourself. So we light this chalice for our community. May its light shine. Let us enable beloved community. Let us celebrate the blessings of imperfection. Let us be wholesome. The first hymn is number 83, I think. Winds Be Still, choir and congregation.
Good morning. Today marks the anniversary of the 33rd anniversary of the Capitol Crawl, and we are going to hear a story about that moment in time. This story is called All the Way to the Top, and it is by Annette Bay Pimentel. Jennifer Keelan may be small, but her voice is mighty. Yee-haw! Her horse Snowball responds, speeding up from a walk to a trot. Jennifer loves to go fast, but she knows she'll soon have less time for riding, since she's finally old enough for school. She can't wait to make new friends. She's ready to go. The school's not far. Jennifer rolls outside down the sidewalk to the corner. Stop! A 4-inch curb is a cliff to someone using a wheelchair. Her grandpa eases her wheelchair over the curb. Though the drop jolts Jennifer, she makes it to the building. But stop. The school says Jennifer doesn't belong there because she uses a wheelchair. So instead, Jennifer and her mom find a different school that says she can attend kindergarten, but only for part of the afternoon when lunch is over. As Jennifer rolls in each day, everyone is already busy. She has to figure out what's going on and how to join in. Since most kids there have never met someone who uses a wheelchair, her classmates are confused and even a little afraid. "You'll never be one of us," some of them say. Jennifer knows they're wrong. She is a friend waiting to happen. But how do you change someone's mind? She's not sure, but she's not about to give up. Jennifer and her family hear about activists who are working to make sure that people with disabilities have access to public places like schools. They want to know more, so they attend a strategy meeting. Jennifer has never seen anything like it. The room is full of grown-ups with all sorts of disabilities. Some use wheelchairs, some use canes. None of them are sitting around waiting for things to happen. They're shouting and laughing and planning a big protest to get wheelchair lifts on buses. They turn to Jennifer. "Do you want to come?" Yes, she wants to go. Downtown, Jennifer rolls up to the microphone and tells her story. She leads the marchers through the streets chanting, "The people, united, will never be defeated." It feels good to speak up for what she believes in. She can't wait to do it again. She protests in Phoenix, rolls through streets in San Francisco, and waves signs in Montreal. The demonstrations don't always change people's minds, but Jennifer is used to that. Even when her neighborhood school finally agrees she can attend, she and her classmates with disabilities aren't allowed to eat in the cafeteria with everyone else. That hurts, but she keeps going. Working with the other activists revs her up, and yet she can't help noticing that she and her sister are usually the only kids out there raising their voices. Still, she can't leave all the protesting to grown-ups. She knows firsthand that children with disabilities get ignored too, so she keeps speaking up. Finally, when Jennifer is 8, activists propose a new law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. The law insists schools, governments, and businesses make room for all people, including those with disabilities. Jennifer feels like dancing. If it passes, it means sidewalks with curb cuts, buildings with ramps in addition to steps, and elevators with braille panels. It means Jennifer and her classmates with disabilities can finally go to the cafeteria like everyone else. Jennifer and her family watch the news for updates on the ADA, but reporters never mention it. She switches off the TV in frustration, wishing she could change the reporters' minds about what is worth talking about. Instead, the Keelans get their news about the ADA when activist friends call. It's bad news. Members of Congress say the law will be too complicated and too expensive. They say it's just not worth it. Since the news station is ignoring people with disabilities, Jennifer and her friends are determined to find another way to make Congress hear their voices. It's go time. Her family buys plane tickets to Washington, D.C. As they march down Pennsylvania Avenue, Jennifer has never shouted louder. What do we want? The ADA. When do we want it? Now. Finally, they reach the steps of the U.S. Capitol. But stop. A mountain of steps blocks Jennifer and the other people using wheelchairs from the building where Congress makes laws. Grown-ups slide out of their wheelchairs and start pulling themselves up the steps. They will make sure members of Congress know that they are here. Jennifer's heart races. This is what she has been shouting apart. I want to climb the steps, she says. But stop, the grown-ups think she's too young. You can't do it, they tell her. But Jennifer knows this is not just about her. It's about her friends at school who were shut out of the cafeteria during lunch. It's about millions of other kids she's never met who get stopped at every turn. Jennifer wants to speak up for all the kids with disabilities who aren't there. I need to climb the steps, she says. She slides out of her wheelchair, stoops along the sidewalk to the bottom of the stairway, and puts her hands on the first step. She hauls herself up. Tiny bits of dirt and rocks dig into her skin. She drags herself up another step, and the crowd roars. Reporters surround her with cameras and microphones recording her gutsy climb. I'll take all night if I have to, she vows. And she keeps heaving, hauling, dragging herself up those steps. She keeps going all the way to the top. Pictures of Jennifer climbing the steps flash around the world. Reporters start talking about the ADA. Members of Congress see the news, listen to the activists, and finally pass the ADA. Laws like the ADA don't change things overnight. Entrances have to be rebuilt, sidewalks redesigned, buses re-engineered. Slowest of all, minds have to change. So Jennifer will continue shouting and waving signs, organizing and explaining. She will continue fighting for what she knows is right. Jennifer has places to go, and nothing will stop her now. Y'all, I always tear up when I'm reading this, but it was real bad today, so I try not to read this too often. But yeah, Jennifer Killen was a real activist, and this is a true story. And if you look up the Capitol crawl, you can watch footage of her shouting, "I'll climb all night if I have to," which was like kind of the moment that broke the ADA. So I would definitely recommend watching that if you haven't seen it.
We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the world. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the world. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love.
Our reading this morning is a poem, and it's a poem about an acquired disability, which is one that you gain a little later in life. And this is Disabled Country by Neil Marcus. If there was a country called disabled, I would be from there. I live disabled culture, eat disabled food, make disabled love, cry disabled tears, climb disabled mountains, and tell disabled stories. If there was a country called disabled, I would say she has immigrants that come to her from as far back as time remembers. If there was a country called disabled, then I am one of its citizens. I came there at age 8. I tried to leave, was encouraged by doctors to leave. I tried to surgically remove myself from disabled country, but found myself in the end staying and living there. If there was a country called disabled, I would always have to remind myself that I came from there. I often want to forget. I would have to remember to remember. In my life's journey, I am making myself at home in my country.
And now Elizabeth will lead us in the reading of the names for the day of mourning.
So this is a ritual that traditionally takes place on March 1st, and it's honored as the Disability Day of Mourning, but in this kind of congregation, we're going to celebrate it today. Some folks honor it throughout March. On this day each year, the disability community comes together to remember the victims of filicide, people with disabilities who are killed by their family members or caregivers. Vigils are held on the day of mourning in cities around the world. When we talk about filicide, we are talking about a pattern of violence that starts when a parent or caregiver murders their child or adult relative with a disability, and that continues in how these murders are reported, discussed, justified, excused, and replicated. From the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, who coordinate this project, we see the same pattern repeating over and over again. A parent kills their disabled child. The media portrays these murders as justifiable and inevitable due to the burden of having a disabled person in the family. The victims are disregarded, blamed for their own murder at the hands of the person they should have been able to trust the most, and ultimately forgotten, and the cycle repeats. Today, as is the tradition, we will be reading the names of those who are on record as having been murdered by caregivers in the United States in the past year. A few names are either unknown or have been purposely redacted for legal or cultural reasons, in which case the person is listed by age and gender. If you would like more information about this project or these people, you can visit disabilitymemorial.org. And I've invited some folks to help us read the names this morning.
Rosemary Webster, La Quinta, California, 85. Treshawn Brown Beckley, West Virginia, 7. Catherine Newhouse, Canton, Georgia, 19. Thomas Conley Sherman, Connecticut, 63. Heather Baynard, Gaffrey, South Carolina, 14. Bailey Cowell, Toledo, Ohio, 18. Stephen Earl, South Bend Township, 59. Braylon Hines, Fort Wayne, Indiana, 2. M.E., Albuquerque, New Mexico, 16. Harvey Baker, Topeka, Kansas, 74. Carla Jacobs, West Point, Illinois, 74. Gertie Duncan, Leesburg, North Carolina, 79. 2-year-old girl, Davenport, Florida. Sarah Latimer, Sparta, Wisconsin, 32. Sharon Mook, Mount Laurel, New Jersey, 82. Jamie Ward, Greenfield, Wisconsin, 50. Eli Hart, Mound, Minnesota, 6. Kimberly Bridges, Fairbanks, Alaska, 65. King Dewey, Port Arthur, Texas, 3.
Joanne Harris, Trussville, Alabama, 82. Donna Mayfield, Overland Park, Kansas, 87. John Hoover, Hickson, Tennessee, 44. 72-year-old man, Brooklyn, New York. Catherine Solkovich, Baldwin, Missouri, 63. Kadaris Maddox, Clarksville, Tennessee, 13. Timothy Ferguson, Norton Shores, Michigan, 15. Gabriel Rowe, Druzy, Oregon, 16. Michael Logson, Glasgow, Kentucky, 75. Annette Boyle, Charleston, South Carolina, 83. Dominic Paddock Wood, Fort Wayne, Indiana, 4. Adam Cortez, Danville, Pennsylvania, 27. Eleanor Bernard, Brooklyn, New York, 77. Chanel Colquhoun, Brooklyn, New York, 26. Patricia Martinez, Bezar County, Texas, 57. Joanna Parker, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 72. Amora Milborn, Cary, North Carolina, 3. Ernest Senna Sr., Albuquerque, New Mexico, 62. Jonathan Union, Boone County, West Virginia, 48. Andreas Huertas, Bronx, New York, 37.
Shanice Watts, Laurel, Mississippi, 34. Bernadette, Lisa, and Matthew Stedman, Elraya, Ohio, 92, 60, and 34. May Brown, Chicago, Illinois, 87. 15-year-old boy, Brownsville, Texas. Hunter Drew, Mount Auburn, Illinois, 3. Hayden Garifa, Edinburgh, Pennsylvania. Alice Matheny, Eaton, Ohio, 93. Vincent Roebuck, Mount Washington, Pennsylvania, 72. Patrice Johnson, Queens, New York, 26. Josiah Green, Brooklyn, New York, 18. Edward Collison, Hitchcock, Texas, 45. Aria Smith, Miami Beach, Florida, 3. Megan Fricks, Cummings, Georgia, 26. Skylar Wilson, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 4. Mary Fisher, Las Vegas, Nevada, 72. Colleague Bogan, Tupelo, Mississippi, 5. Athena Brownfield, Cecil, Oklahoma, 3. Let us take all these names into our hearts, and may they be remembered. May they be honored. May they be thought of. Let it be.
Before I begin the sermon this morning, I want to give you a bit of a content warning because we are going to touch on some intense topics today, as we have been. We're going to talk about discrimination and murder and sterilization and the eugenics movement. And if you are visiting us today, I promise we don't do this every week, but it is important sometimes. But I say this because I want you to know that it is always okay to step out for a moment, or to come chat after the service. There is no shame in taking care of yourself, but if you can stay and listen, I encourage you to do so. As many of you know, our Unitarian Universalist Association is called to periodically review what's called Article 2, which contains our principles and purposes. They've stayed the same for a little while now, since 1984. But the current Article 2 Commission is proposing a new draft for us at General Assembly. By the way, if you want to learn more about that, you can look it up on their website. But the important thing is that when they were soliciting comments for these changes, the Commission kept on hearing about how important our first principle was to UUs. These words call back to our Unitarian and Universalist belief that humans are essentially good and that everyone is worthy of salvation. Whether or not we adopt the new Article 2, it is clear that upholding the inherent worth and dignity of every person is central to our theology. And yet, we live in a world that struggles to make that true. There are many ways in which this is so, the current horrifying outbreak of anti-trans laws across our country being just one recent example. I'm here to talk to you this morning about some of the ways in which this is still true and for my own community. As we heard in our story, in 1990 on March 12th, disabled activists quite literally dragged themselves up the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., on live television to demonstrate some of the need for the Americans with Disabilities Act. I am personally a member of what has come to be known as the ADA generation, the first generation of disabled people in America to grow up with civil liberties. Thanks to Jennifer Keelan and those who made that crawl with her, as well as those activists who came before them, we have come a long way from where we were when I was born in 1989. But I do want to make you try to understand a little this morning how different my life still is from that of my able-bodied contemporaries. I simply do not experience the right to movement, to marriage, to parenthood, to employment, to education that many of you have. To begin with, my freedom of movement is significantly curtailed, not because I use this rollator, but because despite the ADA, many existing buildings, private residences, and transit systems remain inaccessible. I had to go to seminary through a door in the basement every day, y'all. Now that I think about it, also college, so it's kind of, and that's when I could get in at all. And places of worship, too, are explicitly exempt from the ADA, thanks to a very successful interfaith campaign. And although UUs did not fight in that campaign, we have taken advantage of it. But the problem runs much deeper than that. Although I enjoy living in Massachusetts, it's not entirely my choice. There are actually only 4 states in which disabled people can work without restrictions and also retain access to adequate health insurance. And although former President Donald Trump's escalated version is no longer in effect, immigration still evaluates immigrants according to whether they're likely to become a public charge, as do most countries. I do not precisely have marriage equality either. There are a number of vital benefits many disabled people are required to give up if we marry, or in some cases, if we accept employment, making marriage and employment effectively a death sentence for many people, although fortunately not for me. Unsurprisingly, therefore, disabled people are half as likely to be employed as our able-bodied counterparts, as well as half as likely to obtain a degree. And family courts routinely and systemically discriminate against disabled parents in matters of custody. And it is very much worth noting that all of these disparities increase significantly when you filter by race. But there are more actively sinister forms of discrimination that show disabled people that our lives are not considered much of the time to possess either dignity or worth in this country. First of all, there are discriminatory healthcare evaluations that propose to literally value the lives of disabled people at a fraction of the price of lives of able-bodied people. More recently, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, government agencies had to frequently issue reminders that it is actually illegal to discriminate against disabled, to ration medical care on the basis of disability. And activists posted kits with advice for how to humanize yourself to hospital staff. Despite this, a hospital in Texas seemingly murdered a Black disabled man by the name of Michael Hickson by denying him appropriate medical care purely because they believed his life was not worth living. In Canada, medical aid in dying laws, which many wish to implement here, have been recommended for disabled people who were just denied social services. And right here in Canton, autistic children are treated with electric shock devices at the notorious Jug Rotenberg Center, which is nationally infamous. 20 states have banned the use of this so-called electric shock therapy, and the UN has declared it to be torture. Activists across the country, including our own Side with Love, have tried to stop this plant through state ballot initiatives and even an FDA ban, which failed just this past year. But the center has continued this for over 30 years now. And perhaps most glaringly, an estimated half of the victims of police violence are disabled. 33 years on from the ADA, I cannot realistically conclude that disabled people have anything like approaching equal rights in this country. But very little of this discrimination came about by accident. Much of it was by a very specific design. As you may know, I am a historian of the eugenics movement, and the reason I think it is so vitally important to study this time in that time period and our denomination's involvement in it is because all of the things that I have just named are policies that can be traced back to eugenic theories and laws, many of which were, it must be said, either created or propagated by the Unitarians and Universalists of that day, and which were deeply, deeply entwined with our social justice movements. Just to explain what eugenics is, in 1888, the British scientist Sir Francis Galton coined the term eugenics, which means good in birth from Greek, to describe what he conceived of as a new science of human breeding based on Darwinian principles. He thought that it was possible to essentially improve on the process of evolution and perfect the human race by introducing selective breeding. Eugenics would essentially eliminate the unfit. This category was supposed to primarily consist of disabled people, but also frequently included people of color, Catholics, immigrants generally, as well as people who were just poor. I cannot give a full account of Unitarian and Universalist involvement with the eugenics movement this morning, and I'm not going to try. But I can say that on an institutional level, Universalists adopted the 1917 Universalist Mission on Social Principles, Declaration of Social Principles, which was penned largely by Clarence Skinner, which called for a safeguarding of marriage so that every child shall be born with a sound physical, mental, and moral heritage, which might not sound too bad, but it is a common eugenics talking point, and in his own work, Skinner was much more explicit. He wrote, criminology brings incontrovertible evidence that delinquency finds its roots in congenital defect and preventable neglect. And eugenics hold forth an alluring picture of a perfected race produced through social control of birth. The AUA and Beacon Press each published a wide variety of popular eugenic tracts. Then too, we cannot look at our early and genuine advocacy for pacifism, birth control, sex ed, education, feminism, without taking into account the way in which eugenics was woven into these endeavors. For example, it is often noted with pride that many important Unitarian and Universalist figures were very active in the favor of pacifism on the eve of World War I, and that's true. But one of these voices was the famous Universalist David Starr Jordan, who became president of Stanford, and his motivation for seeking peace was that according to Jones, war artificially kills the strongest and most fit and leaves behind the unfit to reproduce, thus weakening the white race. One of his books, published by Beacon Press, was entitled The Blood of the Nation, a study of the decay of races through the survival of the unfit. One of his most prominent collaborators was John Haynes Holmes, who likely did not endorse any such thing himself. He was strongly and publicly committed to anti-racism. However, Holmes was also one of the strongest advocates for eugenics marriage laws, and he did not believe that people with disabilities should marry. Similarly, Unitarians and Universalists advocated for freely available birth control and sex ed at a time when doing so publicly was almost unthinkable and borderline illegal. The Universalists were supposedly the first movement to openly support birth control. But although these advocates genuinely believed in giving all women more control over their lives and their choices, this was never their sole motivation. In the words of Margaret Sanger, the eugenicists wanted to shift the birth control emphasis from less children to the poor to more children for the rich. We went back of that and sought first to stop the multiplication of the unfit. A similar line of reasoning motivated Unitarian efforts to support euthanasia. Many of its supporters openly advocated for the wholesale mercy killing of disabled infants and imbeciles, including Unitarian turned humanist minister Charles Francis Potter, who you may have heard of, and Dr. Inez Celia Philbrick, who was one of, unfortunately, the earliest female doctors and who was very active in suffrage and in the fight to end child labor. Well-meaning Unitarians also founded the Fernald School in Waltham, which wound up providing a blueprint for the effective imprisonment of disabled people within similar institutions that were nominally masquerading as schools, and was notoriously shut down when it was the subject of 1994 Senate hearings, in which it was revealed that scientists from MIT had been experimenting with feeding radiation-laced oatmeal to children at Fernald without their knowledge. The crowning legal victory of the American eugenics movement was the 1927 Supreme Court case Buck versus Bell, in which the state of Virginia sought the right to sterilize a young woman, Carrie Buck, without her knowledge. Two important Unitarian figures were involved with this decision as members of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and President William Howard Taft, who would soon be appointed president of the National Unitarian Conference. Holmes wrote the opinion in the case in which he famously wrote the concluding line, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. I want to emphasize the enormous impact of this decision. 33 states passed eugenic sterilization laws, and approximately 60,000 people were sterilized under these laws against their will and often without their consent, without their knowledge, through the 1970s. Likewise, 40 states passed eugenic marriage laws, the last of which was not repealed until 2008. These policies also served as one of the primary inspirations for the laws of the Nazi regime. One of the first actions of Hitler's government was to pass a sterilization law based on the one used in Buck versus Bell. Our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors are in no way fully responsible for this outcome, but they do not bear no responsibility either. And this is, I think, is why it is so vitally important to remember our first principle, because if you begin to allow that some lives have more value than others, and that it is your right to make the decision about which lives those are, then how can it lead anywhere but here? But of course, that is not where our story ends. We did not remain committed to that path, neither as a nation nor as a faith, and we have come a long way since the 1920s and 30s. Nationally, the disability rights and disability justice movement, including those who carried out the independent living centers, the 504 sit-in, the Capitol Crawl, the ACA protests, and the current work of the Sins Invalid Collective, deserve much of the credit for the progress we've made. I can't tell this story this week without mentioning the work of Judy Heumann, who passed away unexpectedly 2 weeks ago. As a young woman, she was told that she couldn't attend school because her wheelchair was a fire hazard. But she went on to become a teacher. And then she found, with other activists, she founded the first independent living center in the country. With support from allies, including the Black Panthers and queer activist groups, she helped stage the 504 sit-ins in 1977, the longest occupation of a government building to date, to finally implement Section 504, the first piece of federal civil rights legislation for disabled people in America. And within our own denomination, much has shifted as well. Historically, we backed away from the eugenics movement and embraced a different destiny, with ministers like the Sharps traveling to Nazi-occupied Europe to effect rescues and provide aid. And today, we have included disability justice as a stated aim of our movement, and we have a national identity group and equal access, of which I am a part. And many of our congregations are now seeking ways to include those whom we have historically marginalized, including our disabled siblings. This congregation, in particular, has actually gone further than many, installing ramps and a low pulpit. We have 2 low pulpits now, printing large print programs, and experimenting with hybrid worship and events. But as we can see from just looking around, we do have a long way still to go. I know that there is much in this morning's sermons that has been especially bleak. It is, after all, a day of mourning. But I think we can at least find hope in the fact that it need not remain this way. In the words of our hymn that we sang this morning, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, come yet again come. We can engage with new research about our past. We can build elevators and add captioning and train our volunteers around trauma. We can, in short, work towards restorative justice and expansive welcome. Because contrary to what our eugenicist forebears may have believed, our heritage does not determine our destiny. We cannot ignore our history, but we can confront it and learn from it and ultimately let it go. Doing so will help us work towards a world in which we can say that we truly value the inherent worth and dignity of every person, without question and without exception. Let us vow to listen to the truth of one another's lives and have the courage not to turn away. And that we can all, regardless of our identities, work together to create a world in which we honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Go in peace.